So what I want to do tonight, if I can get the clicker to work, there it is. Spend a very short amount of time on the Every Student Succeeds Act. We've got other speakers at other points in the agenda or over the couple days that are going to talk about that. But at the same point, representing the US Department of Education, I've learned if I don't say something, people ask questions. So I'm going to say a couple things on that, but try to keep it pretty brief, very high level. And I really want to get back to what the theme of the conference is and what you're all working on, which is unlocking the power of your data. And one way to unlock that power is by connecting it. And how do you appropriately and safely connect the data you have, the data you are creating, with other data that might have previously existed or possibly is in the hands of some other part of state government or local agencies or whatever it might be. So thinking about connections between levels, from a school to a school district to the Pennsylvania Department of Education up to the US Department of Education in some cases. Between phases of education, K-12, as we know, is not an island. Kids have had some education as they arrive at kindergarten, varying degrees, and kids will continue as adults and continue to be learners past K-12. How do you connect that? And then also industries, because for the most part, education, it might depend upon healthcare, it might be influenced by justice statistics, it might have a supreme bearing upon workforce, and those are the types of things a lot of state governments are wrestling with. How do we take what we know is happening in education and put it to play in other parts of the state? So we're going to talk a lot about connections, how to see what some states have been doing, talk a little bit about what Pennsylvania is doing, and try to carry some things forward. At the core of all that, as I know all of you, this is a preaching to the choir sort of moment, data quality. You know, there's so many different idioms and sayings and other things, but if you're working with data and it's not the right data, it's either the right data at the wrong time or it's the wrong data, you're not going to get what you're looking for. It's not going to have the impact you think it's going to have. So we do want to spend a little bit of time on that. And then I'll talk a little bit about the statewide longitudinal data system grant program, which is a program that my office runs, granting to state education agencies. We got out 16 grants in the fall of 2015, Pennsylvania winning one of them. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So the Every Student Succeeds Act. I think most people at this point are aware of it. I think most people have started hearing bits and pieces about what's coming down the road. And there's not a whole lot I can say that you couldn't already read, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've, at the US Department of Education, worked since December when the law was passed. So the law is different in many significant ways than the No Child Left Behind law before it. Right? You've got states in a much more powerful role in terms of setting their accountability goals, determining their accountability models, what exactly they're going to do to focus on underperformance. Underperforming schools is still an explicit focus in the law. It is to find out, but what exactly is a state, is a regional group, is a local education agency going to do to intervene and help a school that's been struggling and is underperforming in the lowest 5% of schools? A lot more open models there for the state to determine, for states individually or working in collaboration with each other to figure out. So that power to evaluate education and make a decision and put measures and models forward is going to be a lot more in the hands of the states as this rolls out. And that's obviously put an interesting spin on how we need to operate at the US Department of Education, how we think about report cards, how we're going to think about reporting within specific programs, whether it be Title I or whether it be English learners under Title III. What are we going to be getting at? And so a lot of those decisions are still to come. That's part of what my office, which is in charge of an initiative called EDD Facts. We collect the aggregate performance data for all of the major formula programs. We're working with the program offices right now to start to figure out what needs to change. What are you as the program office thinking about? How do we help find the right measure, the right piece of information to be collected on that? Student scores, how they're used in teacher evaluation is another thing explicitly discussed in the law. There's a focus on pre-K that's explicitly discussed. And most importantly, there's transition time. A lot of times you'll get a law passed in a December timeline and they'll put something in there, wanting immediate data, starting with that school year that's already in play sometimes, or the very next school year. We've got some time on this one. We've got some programs and some immediate concepts that have come to an end. The law was very specific in saying that flexibility waivers that have been set up by Secretary Duncan, those will expire in August. So there's a timeline to bring those down to a close. What exactly will the next school year be like, and how will we get to a full implementation by the 17-18 school year? Because that's really the timeline that we're looking at. So there's been a lot of discussion already, and there will be a lot more discussion going forward. So just to give a quick overview of what we've been doing at the department to make decisions, to come to some level of decision on this. The law was passed in December. We started immediately putting out dear colleague letters, putting out calls for comments. A request for information notice was published by the end of the month, and comments were received all through the month of January. As a result of those comments, the first official step that the department took was to announce 2 areas where we would be doing formal rulemaking. Formal rulemaking on a federal law, you have to identify a panel of experts, formal times when they come together in very public sessions. The 2 areas were the assessment systems and the supplement, not supplant language, which if you're all spending your time educating kids, that's not where you're concerned. But the Pennsylvania Department of Education people and people working in the finances, if you're in that role of your local education agency, it becomes very important to think about. So those were the 2 areas where in February we said we're going to do formal rulemaking. We're going to pull panels of experts together. And we held those meetings in March and in April. And by the end of April, consensus had been reached on language that should be used moving forward for assessments. No consensus was reached on supplement, not supplant. So we'll be coming back with some more steps on that, but there is a statement out there. There's some things you can read. And what happened most recently in April, very end of April, was the department said, in addition to this formal rulemaking that we're doing with this hand, we would like more input on guidance the field wants from us. Guidance is not binding, guidance is guidance. What are we at the department, what would you like us to clarify inside this law? What areas? And I know there's not a lot of time left, but May 25th is when the formal comment period asking for input on our guidance closes. So there is a website or an email address, a number of other things. State may have already submitted things. Private citizens have submitted information. It is not limited who can provide information to us. We are looking for formal input on where would you like to see the U.S. Department of Education give additional clarifications, non-binding, non-regulatory guidance on the new Every Student Succeeds Act. So that closes on the 25th, so I did just want to take a minute and recognize that. So in addition to assessments and the supplement, not supplant language, which gets very technical, there are other areas where there has been a lot of discussion. We have gotten a lot of comments. What exactly will these state-driven accountability systems, how will they need to comply with some sort of national structure? It's a great question. A lot of places that we've gotten some input. So we're looking at that and thinking about what we might do there. What exactly do the report card requirements mean? There's a lot of language that Congress put in the law about specifics in the report cards, but it's still open to a lot of interpretation. And what about educator evaluation and equity? These are areas where maybe we need some formal, not rulemaking all the way, but some regulation we release for public comment. Maybe we just need non-binding guidance. These are the conversations that are happening. So those are all the areas where the law is open to a lot of formal discussion, a little less formal discussion. What we're doing inside the department in my office is meeting with all the programs, the people who run the grant programs, to find out what changes are they envisioning as they've gotten to understand the section of the law most important to them, the thing that drives their specific grant program. And so we're asking the questions internally. How is reporting going to change? Because we have to take that and, of course, talk to the Pennsylvania Department of Education and all other state offices who have to turn that around and pass it down to local school districts. We know in doing all of this and thinking about these changes, right? Some things are clean and simple and easy. There will be no more reporting of AYP. There will be no more AYP determinations, AMOs, AMAOs, HQTs, the way they've been defined, highly qualified teachers. Those are all moving out. Something else will move in. What exactly is going to move in some of those spaces? That's where the programs are still working with us. We know that some of these changes in how the program operates will result in new data needing to be reported to the U.S. Department of Education. That has not been finalized. We are hoping that we're going to have a public comment period open this summer to start that conversation about the 17-18 school year. One of the things that we've heard from states for years is, if you want something new on a school year, we really need to know February at the latest, before that school year starts, what you need so that we can start to message it. We can do technical assistance. We can convene people and figure out what we need to do. So that's what we're shooting for, is that by February of 17, we would know what new things do we need under the Every Student Succeeds Act for the 17-18 school year. So this is our general timeline, right? December, the law was passed. School year 15-16 up through June into July, we're doing a lot of ongoing decision making, right? That's the formal rulemaking, that's the input pieces, that's people talking to the U.S. Department of Education about what they believe they've read in the law, or places where they are looking at the law and asking for clarifications. August of 2016, waivers are over. Any state operating under a waiver right now, that waiver is done. That is in the law. That is not something that we as the department can negotiate. That's the way they wrote that. So we owe everybody some clarity on what exactly the 16-17 school year will look like. How much transition, what are we looking at? Because we're really not expecting full implementation until the 17-18 school year. So as I mentioned, EDD Facts. Very important to some people in the room, a little bit more distant for many of you in the room because you don't directly report data to the U.S. Department of Education, but a lot of what you're working with and sending up through the systems to the Pennsylvania Department of Education, some of it does get aggregated and come up to us in EDD Facts. We have to do public comment periods and formal process for getting clearance to collect all that information. We had gone through a regular process for our 3-year clearance that literally was sitting with the Office of Management and Budget in December when the law was passed. So we immediately got questions about, well, how are you going to change this for the new law? And we said, we can't answer that yet. So they went forward and approved the package as it is. So we have a brand new 3-year clearance that we got in February based upon criteria that were now out of date. So we know we have to go back out. We know we have to open up our public comment for more, to change and modify that package. So we're doing the internal conversation now so that we can put it out for states at some point in the summer and say, here's what we're looking to collect differently. Let states run some conversation, get back to us with that initial feedback. We'll have a lot of dialogue and discussion through the fall and hope to clarify and lock it down by the January-February timeline. Couple things that might not make it all the way into collection into the U.S. Department of Education, but that are important data concepts that are in the law that just I want to make sure people are aware of and thinking about. There's a lot of things. This is a hard slide to read from a distance, I realize, and I'm sure that they'll be available, but a lot of things don't change. There's still a requirement for assessments. There's still a requirement to report on the results for your school, your district, on those assessments. There's some new things hiding in there that you might not immediately see. Subgroups of foster children and children who are connected to a parent active in the military. Those are new subgroups that were not present before. Right? The assessment reporting is still there. Here's some new groups of students that we need to understand. How are we going to measure what's happening to that group of students? Whether or not the state offers high quality preschool. What exactly does high quality mean? How do we define that? What's that going to look like? But these are the requirements. This is what the law talks about and what it says. Right? School level expenditures. How much money is being spent? Not by a district on specific things, but at school level. How do we differentiate school A from school B to school C inside a district? To look at equity, to understand whether or not the same resources, same level of resources are being spent across all schools. What are we using? What is the state model using to differentiate schools within their accountability models? Right? And teacher qualifications. There's an explicit reference in the law talking about understanding inexperienced or emergency or provisionally credentialed teachers and the discrepancy between the amount of those teachers in high poverty schools and low poverty schools. Again, that's what the law says. How do we need to provide some guidance on that? How do we need to clarify what that should look like in terms of reporting to us versus what is a state going to do for how it's going to work out inside their accountability models. There will be differences there, and there'll be a lot of discussion because there is not one accountability structure the way AYP used to have it, where there was one federal framework that every state model had to fit into. Every state model is going to be a little bit more differentiated this time around. So there's a lot of open discussion. That's where we are with the law. There's a lot that's the same. There's a lot that's different. So I don't expect it to have a huge impact upon teachers, upon district operations, until we get into that 16-17 school year and people start thinking about what's going to be different. But wanted to at least give some high-level overview to it at this before we kind of take our attention off the legal structure and try to think about the data itself and how to build some connections. So I mentioned 3 types of connections at the beginning: between levels, across phases of education, and across industries. And I just want to take a little bit of time to walk through some promising models that I know we've seen at the U.S. Department of Education, some of the things that we're getting by working with states and understanding some things. Because this really does seem to me, the more we talk to states, the more we talk to school districts and teachers, that what's happening with data is very, very similar to what's happening to internet and email in the workplace. There was a time, not that long ago, I can remember it, and I'm sure a lot of you can remember it, when email at the workplace was novel. It was new. You had a whole job that didn't depend upon email, right? We, unfortunately, and I'm not proud of this fact, but we have had a day in 2016 when we all showed up to work at the National Center for Education Statistics, and the entire network, including email, was down. And the immediate reaction of most people who work for me was, I guess I just go home. I can't do anything. I was thinking, how do we get to the point you can't do anything? You don't have a document printed out that you could review. You don't have anything to do that doesn't require the internet. And really, the more we kept looking at it and thinking about the way we work with our data systems and the connections and network pieces that were required, it was really hard to get a productive day of work without the internet. And the same thing's happening with data. Right? I can remember in the mid-90s when I was helping create electronic gradebooks. And it really was just that. It was an electronic version of a gradebook. So how do we take what teachers have been writing out for years to understand their set of kids and what's happening, and maybe just make that documentation process a little easier? But as soon as that became easier, people started having other conversations about, well, wait, in my class, I gave that test, and 60% of the kids failed it, but you gave it, and only 20% failed it. So what did you teach differently than what I taught? Same conversations that could have been happening for years, but sometimes just having the data a little bit easier, a little different presentation sparked something. And then what's happened over the recent years is more and more, my data as a teacher or my data as a principal is great, and it's fascinating, and I need it, and I can't manage some things without it, but it gets really powerful if I can take my data and understand all this other data at the same time. And how do I put the two together and understand not just my kids, but my kids in context, my town in a larger picture, and what's happening. I remember working with, when I lived out in California for 7 years, and I was working with the superintendent for Bakersfield City Schools, which is the largest elementary-only school district in California. And she was just struggling with, how do I help my highest performing principal, the principal running my best school? Because we got 25 elementary schools in Bakersfield, and they all look up to this principal, but that principal's really frustrated, knowing there's more. I can do more. I should be able to bring more in. Who should I talk to? Where do I go? And it was those connections of data that started to open up some doors, open up some pictures. So I want to take a second, right? This is the general structure of data across all states in public K-12 right now. LEAs have data. They have it, they manage it, they need it. You have to know who's got graduation requirements, who's in school, who's not in school, who's late. You got to know all these various things. States, over the past 15 years, have put together very robust longitudinal data systems. And when they're working right, and the vast majority of states have them working right now, there's a cyclical nature to those. There's data that goes up, there's larger context and information that comes back down. There's value add to the district for giving that data into the state. A very important data diagonal line exists on this screen because there are lots of people who believe all that data flows right up to the US Department of Education, and it doesn't. Aggregations of data come up to the US Department of Education. So we will say, we need to know how many students at this school were in membership at the school on October 1st by grade, by race, ethnicity, or by gender. And aggregations and counts come up to us. But it is amazing how many times I get into conversations and people believe we're building a national set of student level data. And we're actually explicitly prohibited from doing such a thing, both at K-12 and at post-secondary. So there's an important diagonal line there. But what we want to do is make the requirements as clear as possible so that process of aggregation is streamlined, it's simplified, it's not something that becomes a burden. Each state can work on that cycle inside of the state or how they connect their cycles to other states, whether they be neighbors or whether they just be like-minded partners around the country, right? So that is where the attention, that's where the rich conversation can happen. And the federal reporting, we hope we can keep making more and more streamlined, more and more automated so that it does not need to consume resources. We need to know some things about schools for the amount of money that's given out by the Federal Department of Education. That does not mean we should be creating a lot of burden. And that's something we've been working on. We're not there, we're not where we need to be yet, but we keep moving. Because what we want to do, my office is in charge of K-12 data collection, post-secondary, and also the data system grant program and the development of common education data standards. What we want to do with that is simplify what has to be done for the US Department of Education so that states in convenings like this can really think about what they want to do. So I want to share a couple models from other states. You all know Pennsylvania pretty well. I'll come back to Pennsylvania, but I want to talk for a second about Georgia. And Georgia has been building what they call the tunnel. And the tunnel is a very, well, not very fancy sounding name, but it's a fancy way of connecting local student information systems to that larger picture and that larger context. So they've worked with all the SIS vendors inside the state so that there are portals, there are buttons and triggers inside the student information system that each local school district is working with. So teachers are working in their environment that they've become familiar with. But as soon as they go through this tunnel, they're not just accessing their data. They're getting aggregations of statewide data. They're getting other things. They're getting context. And the whole point and the goal, and it's really hard to read on this slide, and I apologize, but that's not going to make it, is it? That's big star up there. There's two paths here. The top path is all about teaching and learning and what's needed to personalize education, to make sure they've set a goal for an individualized learning experience for every student. How do we get there? And what's needed? And the bottom row is all about teachers, teaching and administration at schools. And how do we learn what we need to learn to know that we are moving where we need to get to and we're getting the outcomes that we need so that it's not just about looking one way to use the data, but supporting both. Because teachers and principals sometimes need very different sets of data, but they may have actually all come from a very similar point in the educational process. The colors in this all have to do with how are they supporting this work. The blue was one of federal grant that they got. The green was a different one. The yellow is money that they've been able to bring on from inside the state. So they're trying to work on sustainability at the same time, not be dependent on one grant to get something done. And they've been transitioning over time to get that there. So they've really looked at this and thought about, how do we make sure teachers don't have to sign on to a second system just to get information from a bigger picture? How can we make sure that the district boundaries and the requirements that we have to make sure people's individual data are safeguarded, how do we put the right data in the right hands? And the tunnel is a very technical solution to doing that, but with the end goal of making it easier for teachers to personalize learning. That's what they're going for. It's not just to have a great tool, it's to drive that purpose that teachers have what they need to understand how one person's education should be different. How do we keep it actionable? How can we make sure that they can combine the data that they need to move forward? So that's what we want to keep enabling. That's what the statewide Longitudinal Data System Grant Program has been about through its many cycles. That's what we want to get done. We all know, and this is where I tread very lightly because I'm about to bring up a topic that I guarantee the vast majority of you who work in local school districts really don't like, which is the civil rights data collection. Yeah, exactly. Grumble, grumble, grumble. Okay, just going to tackle it heads on, right? We are gearing up for another round of civil rights data collection. And what we want to do here, and what we're always trying to get towards, is how do we make these things easier? This is something that has to get done. But we know the reporting isn't making education better in the immediate. It's not where teachers want to be spending their time. It's not where all of you looking at what you're really using data for. This is not the purpose you want to focus your time on. But we have to get it done. Right, so the 15-16 collection is scheduled to open this fall. If you got used to working with it in 13-14, the formats are going to be the same for 15-16. Right, we've got some pre-collection technical systems open right now. There are things going on. What we're trying to figure out with every single state, is there a role the state education agency could play that would help out districts? Some states have been really good at just communicating, being the broker of communication, so that it's not always coming from the Office for Civil Rights or its partner support center, but sometimes it's a message that initiated with them but is now being passed down by the state. Locals understand and will listen to the state sometime a little differently. Or sometimes there's data they can preload, and then the district can come to the system and see, there's a third of my answers are already there. That's less for me to have to now go and do. And so we've got a number of great successful models. We do a conference every July called the Stats DC Conference, where we get states and local education agency representatives down in DC, and I know we're going to have a lot of conversation about what worked well in 13-14's collection and what didn't, because we want to streamline this. I can't stand in front of you and tell you it's going to go away, because I don't think it will. That's a decision for the next administration to figure out. But I'm going to be part of trying to help make it better and better each time. And I feel like we made some good progress with 13-14, so we want to build on that. We want to keep it moving. Another place, just to give you a little bit of sort of the structural context for what a lot of these guys at this table do, right, is put data up through EDFacts. And EDFacts is the connection of all of our data collections into one consolidated, centralized collection. I put a little asterisk at the end of my first sentence there, saying that it's related to federal formula grants, because there are a couple discretionary grant programs. The charter school program, we collect data for them. That's not purely formula. There's a couple things like that that are in there. But what we want to do is, again, be as clear as we can with the definitions. What do we mean when we say in membership? What do we mean behind the adjusted cohort graduation rate, when who should be included and who shouldn't be? How do we make sure all those things are clear? Something that can be easily translatable from our English definition down to the data structure that's needed for someone, so that anybody could say, all right, let me look at my data. What's my data going to look like in that federal picture, if that's something that you need to know and want to know. So the Common Core of data has been collected for generations. It's part of EDFacts for about 10 years now. We've been collecting the two together. But we're actually fixing something in that we used to, at the US Department of Education, be very dependent upon a process at the Census Bureau for processing a lot of that data. And it got processed in isolation from the rest of the data that came in through EDFacts. And so now we've got one team doing it. We're building a new system, a data management system that lets us really work with the data. Again, it's all because we want to streamline this to the point that we are being clear and transparent, and we're getting done what we need to get done, hopefully keeping a focus on why these data are important, letting people work with them, letting people do more. We're just getting that, as I mentioned, those aggregate statistics. But if we pull something in and someone somewhere along the line makes a change to the data that was reported because it didn't pass a business rule or something else happened. And this is something we only do with the Common Core of data. It's a statistical product for the National Center for Education Statistics. And if something's missing, we might have to impute some values. We might have to look at what was reported last year. A program office won't do that because they're looking at what's coming in from my grant program this year. But the statistical one, we might look at that a little bit. But if we change something and we don't have it well documented and we don't have it well connected to all the other things, it raises questions. We have to take those questions back to the state, who may have to turn around and take questions back down to a district. We want to minimize those. So our data management system is all about keeping things transparent, making sure there's only one version ever. It's not often some isolated trunk process being worked on over here while other data is being worked on over here. It's central. There's a window. It's the same window into the same data for the federal folks who are looking at it, for state folks who are looking at it. If they want to, they could pass pieces of it down to local school districts so that hopefully we spend less and less time asking questions about that data that the federal government just released. Where did it come from? We've got a trail. We've got traceability on it. And traceability is one of those important pieces for data quality. We weren't doing a good job. We're putting in a new system to do a better job. And I should say that Pennsylvania does have some phenomenal EdFacts coordinators. I don't know how much gets passed down to you guys, but Dave and Joe Cowan and the team, they make it look seamless from our end. Data comes up, data passes our business rules, things move along more often than not. So how, you guys clearly have got something working inside the state. That process to get data moving, get things through, aggregate it and report it up is working. Hopefully allowing more time for other things. For example, thinking about how K-12, post-secondary, early childhood, and all these things come together. Right? 40 states currently link K-12 data to post-secondary data. 33 states currently link K-12 to early childhood data. Some of them are doing it in something that we have come to call an early childhood integrated data system, but not all of them. Because linking data or connecting data doesn't necessarily mean you are integrating everything into one system with one sign-on and one way of looking at things. It could be, yes, 3 times a year I can take this data and I can take that data and we run a routine. We can then look at things together, we can generate reports, and then we go on our way. It's linkable. Does that mean it's truly integrated? Well, why would you want to integrate it? That's the great question that needs to be asked first. So Pennsylvania can do, you guys get checks for both of these linkages. What exactly does that look like in your system? How exactly do you go through? It's based and it's rooted in data governance. Why would we want to connect the data? What are we going to get out of bringing post-secondary data from all of our public post-secondary institutions and connecting it to K-12? Why would we want to do that? What's the end goal we're trying to reach? What information can we pass back down that we can't pass back down otherwise? Right? How do we get that done? What are we looking at? Especially when people get thinking about early childhood. There are so many sources of information across early childhood. If you think about all of the non-public providers, whether they might be affiliated with a church, whether they might just be a private citizen running a preschool, the number of different things that can get done, but the sources of information are huge. And how do you think about what you want to learn from that would then inform the K-12 system, understanding where kids are coming in, what starting point are they at when you think about kindergarten? Data governance is what actually drives this. When push comes to shove, it's a set of decision rules. It's a bunch of people who are stakeholders in a system sitting down and saying, we're going to agree to all establish some common rules on how we do this. We're going to say this person makes that decision, this person makes that decision, and we're all going to live with those decisions because we're going to make them in a collaborative fashion. It's not easy. It takes years to build these types of cultures. We've been doing it at the U.S. Department of Education. We formally set up a data governance board back in 2007. We've got great participation from some offices. We've got some offices that are still kind of, in on some of the conversation, but not on all of it. But how do you figure out who needs to be involved? What boundaries need to be established so that you can make sure the right data are being connected or are being moved or are being aggregated, right? How are these decisions getting made? If you're not asking those basic questions, you're not getting the next steps of data governance. And what the data governance is going to do is make sure that you don't wind up sending something up to the superintendent or to the school board and then realizing, oh, wait a minute, we used the wrong version. We connected to the wrong data. We did something that leads down that next embarrassing path. But it gets really complicated when you're thinking about it beyond K-12 and you want to bring other things in. So a good model, a good example, and not too far away if we want to set up a type of visit, is Delaware, who's been looking at something called Early Learning Insight. It's part of a much broader initiative that they're running called Education Insight, where they've gotten the Departments of Education, Department of Services for Children and Youth, Department of Health and Social Services, all working together to ask the question, what do we want from our data sets? How can we bring them together? What is our goal, right? And they have developed a strategic plan for comprehensive early childhood. How are we going to help kids be ready for kindergarten. Not as our education department and not as our Head Start programs, but as a state, thinking about all of these things. Once they had agreement that they needed to work together, and once they designed a strategic plan, they could then think about the specifics of the data that they wanted to bring together so that they could understand and deliver reports to every district about the set of kids coming in as kindergartners and what they knew and what they didn't know. They worked with focus groups, they pulled all sorts of things together, they had to do data sharing agreements, but it was first from this core principle: why do we want to do this? And then what decision rules do we need to set up to make sure it's going to happen correctly? And they've got something moving. It's obviously not perfect, but they've got a lot of things going on there to try to corral the different forces that are at play inside early childhood in Delaware and connect it up to the K-12 student information system that they're managing and that they're running. There it is. All right, and lastly, for other industries, right? 26 states currently connect K-12 not just to their post-secondary, but also to workforce data. And this is where it gets really hard, because in the vast majority of states, the one thing you can't use as a student identifier is a social security number. And the one thing they have in every workforce record is a social security number. So if you want to understand, what about these kids who graduated 5, 6 years ago? Are they productively engaged in the workforce of our state? It becomes really, really challenging. And so we spend a lot of time, states like Arkansas have spent a lot of time and a lot of effort trying to figure out how do you do that type of probabilistic matching and what's the best way to get some things done and how can we understand whether this record and this record actually represent the same individual. So there's a lot of good models out there, but they all either start successfully or fail quickly based upon one thing, and that is, did they think about the privacy laws? Right? We've put a lot of time and effort into this at the U.S. Department of Education by bringing on a position we didn't have 10 years ago called the Chief Privacy Officer. We should have, but we didn't. But she's great. I don't know if Kathleen Stiles has ever spoken in front of any of you, but she will just lay out everything about the laws. And if you're not thinking through, why should this person be seeing that education record? What's the point? What's the purpose? Do we have authority? But it all gets back, like the data governance, to the use. And if you're not thinking about the use, you can't then ask the question, does this person have the right authority to see that record? But there's also an important thing that our Privacy Technical Assistance Center will always bring up, which is not everybody needs to see the individual student record. It could be in the system in a number of different ways, and the right people can see the right personalized, identifiable information because they are actively working with that kid. But the results and the outcomes of that child's record could be used inside other things that then go off. Maybe it's in an aggregated fashion. Maybe it's in some other way. You get a report not about a school or not about a classroom, but about a community. And inside that, it says something about what we know. That's what a lot of people are starting to explore. You don't always need to present back out the student unit record. Very often you need to use it, and do you have the right controls on top of it to make sure that the right people are working with it. You notice the document on the left here, which I just took out of PTAC's website. That's why the URL is there. Right? Policy for users of student data. That's where your policy starts. It doesn't start with the data. It starts with the users of the data. And who are they? And should they be unit record level users or should they be aggregate users? And how does it go forward? So one state that's done a lot with this and thinking about workforce is Mississippi. Right? And so one of the things that they've done, they've connected their education data and their workforce data, right, to start, and this is just one module, to look at occupation search. So you can come into the system, and you can pick an occupation and go ahead and do a search. You can then go and you can filter down by education levels and say, all right, I want to work, I'm looking in this field, but I can get to an associate's degree. I can't guarantee anything past an associate's degree right now. So let's filter this down. Let's look just at associate's degrees. And once you got those basic parameters in place, the dashboard that comes up will give you actual information on the number of current and projected jobs with median annual salaries for those fields with that level of an education. And then there are links in the system to help the user find out training programs, education programs, coursework that's needed to move in that direction. right? So they're trying to figure out, what do we know about our state as a labor market and what's going to be needed? And how do we help people currently in education understand where their trajectory might take them or where they may start to fall short? So this is one of the things they're doing with their FY15 statewide longitudinal data system grant. And they're really starting to build some momentum. But again, they started with that core question. What do we want to do? We want to help people understand what they're going to need to do to find a job in the state of Mississippi. Great. Let's get the right people in the room. Let's figure out the decisions we need to make. Let's figure out the data usage and data sharing agreements. Let's get a governance structure in place. And they've been putting these things together and building on it. So I said I was going to come back to Pennsylvania, right? Highlighted 3 other states, not because there isn't any great stuff to talk about in Pennsylvania, but because I wanted to save it for this, which is, as we all know, if the data quality is not right, all these systems, all these great ideas, you can have a great governance model and everything falls apart. Pennsylvania, I was wrong. I thought this was your 2nd year doing this conference. It's your 3rd. You guys just having the conversation that you're having are way out in front of most states. And the amount of conversation that I've gotten about what has been happening here, and unfortunately I can't stick around. I need to be in the office tomorrow down in DC, but I would love to stay and be part of the conversations, because getting all of you together for 3 days to talk about the issues that play out of this and why are we using the data, and what are we using it for, and what are the challenges, what happens, how do we make sure we're getting the right data in, right? These are the key questions that if you're going to be in this business and you're going to be moving towards, you know, the burgeoning field of an education data scientist, part of the questions is, well, what's happening? Where does that record get created? Who's putting it in place? Is it the teacher as part of what they do, and do they have an easy way of getting it done so it doesn't burden them? Or does the record go off and get sitting in a pile and somebody else who's also the transportation coordinator and the attendance secretary and 3 other things, are they putting the data in? You know, and what are the data quality implications of those different models, right? What about an element of data or an instance of data, right? I got my record and I'm tracking that kid. I know that everything that happens is this record, this kid, but what about the individual things that are in there? And how do we know when they got created, how they've been maintained? Again, we're back to that traceability that we weren't doing well inside our data. Right? Reasonability. Once you got it all collected, is anybody taking a chance at some point to look at it, step back and say, does this make sense? Does our set of data about our kids, or did something happen and something's not translating right and it's moving around, right? And lastly, and in many ways for me, because I work at the US Department of Education and we have to deal with every single state, are the definitions and the language the same? Are people, when they say graduation, how similar is that term, right? Or when they talk about algebra, we always have this fun with when is an algebra class or not an algebra class and all the things that happen, because every state is different. Every state's standards. We can come together on Common Core standards. There's still unique differences about a state, and that's an important thing to recognize. So we started a number of years ago Common Education Data Standards. And the point of the data standards is to put together a conceptual data dictionary of definitions and relationships and make sure it's out there for the purpose of creating a common platform for discussing data and data uses. There's 2 things that we've been really pushing on and helping people do with the data standards. One is an alignment. You have a data dictionary, Common Education Data Standards is a data dictionary. How similar are they? Align your data dictionary with the common one. Then once you've done that, what are the uses you're trying to put your data towards? Whether it's a dashboard or a report card, or maybe it's a very specific analysis that you run for your Board of Education every year, or you run for the secretary. How can we define that out as a connection, a way of using a set of elements together so that we can move some things forward, right? And then once you get that defined back to the common data standards, you can find other people, whether they be in Pennsylvania or Delaware or Illinois or New Mexico or wherever, and compare how you're using the data in the same way. And we've sparked a lot of good conversations, but a lot of this is still growing and still moving. So the last thing I just wanted to say, the statewide longitudinal data system grant program. We awarded 16 new grants. 1 of them went to Pennsylvania. We awarded them in 6 priority areas. And I say this only because from a federal perspective on what are the data systems, what are the uses that we're seeing, that we're hearing from people that they would like more support getting towards, these were the 6 that we really felt we could put the grant program together. And if we focused around these priorities, we would get a lot of interest. And we did. we got applications from over 40 states on equity and return on investment, educator talent management, early learning, career and college, evaluation and research, instructional support. Most of our grant awards were in those last couple, college and career, instructional support, evaluation and research. Pennsylvania, yours focused on 2, instructional support and evaluation and research. We are hoping to be able to do more grants. All depends upon Congress, all depends upon money. So fiscal year 17 will start in October of 2016. Probably start with what we call a continuing resolution, which is common business in the federal government. I'm sure every state's about the same, where the lawmakers can't quite set a budget level, so they just tell you to do the same thing you've been doing while they, take a little longer to figure it out. It's an election year. I don't know how much longer that's going to mean. We're going to have to wait and figure it out. But we're hopeful that we can get some more money. We can put some things out there to enable more and more of these uses, because we're really encouraged by what we see Pennsylvania doing, by what we see Mississippi doing, by what we see Washington doing, and we want to help bring the uses. That's where our data system grant program has gone. We're not interested in funding the infrastructure anymore. It's not that it doesn't need to be funded. It's not that it doesn't need to be sustained. But we're funding uses and helping people turn the corner on that next use. Thank you for taking the time. I mean, not many people would find it important enough to take 3 days away, because you all know what piles up while you're here. But I hope the conversations are really helpful. I looked at the agenda, and I think you guys are going to have a great few days talking. I'm honored that I could be here tonight, and I'll send you all off to have a good evening. Thank you very much.